Hey, good evening, everybody, or morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Marty Walser, also known as Raging Owlbear on social media. And this is the fourth episode of sort of a series that I hadn't really intended to make a full series, but here we are. The first episode on games that are alternatives to D&D. And some of them are very D&D like, and some of them are less so. One of the alternatives to D&D that we're going to talk about tonight is called Castles and Crusades. Now, Castles and Crusades is very much what you might consider an old school, um, not quite clone, but an old school sort of homage to basic and advanced Dungeons and Dragons from the early 80s. And it is actually now in its seventh printing. Not an edition. It's pretty much the rules have stayed the same since it was created in 2004. I mean, they've made some errata and minor updates, but this is a very early print of the original Player's Handbook from back in the early 2000s. The version that I flipped up on the screen there is the newer seventh printing that has just been out for the last couple of years. And this game was put out during the sort of third edition era of Dungeons and Dragons, when Wizards of the Coast created what was called the Open Gaming License, which basically meant you could create a D&D like game and use a lot of the same mechanics, and not worry about necessarily the lawyers getting involved. Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast, prior to their Hasbro acquisition, Wizards of the Coast wouldn't necessarily try to sue you out of existence, which was a problem during the TSR era. Because the interesting thing, a little sidetrack, game mechanics are not patentable or trademarked or whatever. A game mechanic is, by definition, open source. Anybody can use the same game mechanic. You just can't use the same language, the copyright language, and there's very specific language that some game companies use to describe the actions that occur in their game. And people sometimes challenge that in court, but be that as it may, getting off the track, in the early 2000s, Wizards of the Coast decided, you know what? Some people in Wizards of the Coast decided, no matter who owns D&D, we want a version of Dungeons and Dragons, some version of Dungeons and Dragons to exist out in the universe. And whether it actually has the Dungeons and Dragons name or not, because as TSR went out of business. The assets, the intellectual property, was acquired by Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast was later acquired by Hasbro. So all along these journeys, at some point, some other company could own the trade name Dungeons and Dragons, or the brand. But the people at the time of third edition realized that Dungeons and Dragons is larger than just the brand. It's this community of gamers. It's this style of play. So they created the Open Game License to allow that style of game to be published under anybody's name, essentially. And Castles and Crusades was one of the made by Troll Lord Games. That is, Troll Lord Games decided to put out Castles and Crusades, and they adapted sort of the mechanics that were put out by Wizards of the Coast under third edition to make a version of sort of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons style game. So Castles and Crusades was really probably considered one of the first old school revival or old school renaissance, depending upon who you ask, the old school games that came out in 2004. There was really only one other that existed prior to that, and that was Hackmaster, the Hackmaster 4th edition, which was more of a parody of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons rather than a serious game. Now, the Hackmaster 5th edition, which I'll probably talk about in an upcoming episode, which I have up on the shelf over here, is actually a much more robust non-AD&D clone. They've changed the rules and made it feel like made it more like less of a parody of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and more like a really hardcore fantasy role-playing game. And that's another favorite of mine, Hackmaster. But getting back to Castles and Crusades, this is a very timely video if you're still watching this in the April timeframe, because right now the seventh printing of the Castles and Crusades Player's Handbook is free. If you go out to the Troll Lord Games site, you can purchase for $0 the Player's Handbook for Castles and Crusades, the newest printing. I'm sorry, in PDF format, not the actual physical copy, but the PDF of the newest version of the Castles and Crusades Player's Handbook. So there's no reason for you, after watching this video, or even in another window as you're watching this video, to not go out and immediately purchase for free the license to the PDF for Castles and Crusades, because it's a wonderful game. And let's talk a little bit about Castles and Crusades, what makes it old school versus sort of 5th edition or 3rd edition or other new school mechanic games. The one nice thing that I really enjoy about Castles and Crusades is that it does get rid of a lot of the sort of crusty mechanics that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons had. AD&D had a lot of little different subsystems depending upon what you were. You know, a rogue had a way to do skills that were different than anything else, and you know, this class over here did something a little different, and everything kind of had lots of different subsystems. And Castles and Crusades, you know, took the sort of idea of the D20 mechanic that 3rd edition and 4th edition, 5th edition have gone through, and said, you know what, we're gonna take that idea. We'll have a single mechanic for all of the type of checks that you have in the game, sort of outside of combat. You know, combat is still the same. You roll to hit against AC. You have some bonuses. You know, whether if you meet the AC or not, you hit, or you do damage. That is. So that the sort of combat subsystem is the same as all versions of D&D, and the only difference is that Castles and Crusades doesn't have a skill system. It uses, like in basic D&D and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, attribute checks instead. So you're rolling against your strength, your intelligence, your dexterity. 5th edition has some of this, but again, 5th edition also has skills. There's no skill system per se in Castles and Crusades. What you have is your class specializes in certain of your attributes. So, you know, for instance, if you're a fighter, you know, strength is your primary attribute. That's one of the things that you're good at because you train, and constitution as well. I don't know all the primes off the top of my head, but, you know, as an example, rogues get dexterity and wizards get intelligence. It's a lot of the stuff that was sort of understood in older versions of Dungeons & Dragons, but never stated explicitly, because the way attribute checks work in Castles and Crusades is there is a base difficulty, and that base difficulty is 12 or 18. Now, it's 12 if you specialize in that particular attribute that's being checked against. So if you're a fighter and you're making a strength check, the base difficulty is going to be 12. If you're a wizard and you're trying to make that same strength check against, you know, lifting up a portcullis and banging down a door or whatever, using some sort of strength check, because that's not what you train at doing all the time, it's not your prime ability, your difficulty class starts at an 18 rather than a 12. So if that particular action is not within your bailiwick, that, you know, and each class has its own set of prime attributes and non-prime attributes, secondary attributes, you know, you're either shooting against 12 or shooting against 18. Now, that is modified against other conditions, obviously. So, you know, if you're going against a creature, for instance, it is modified by their level, by the number of hit dice they have. So, you know, if they're a third level creature, 3 hit dice creature, and you're doing some sort of check against them, then, you know, that base 12 becomes 15 because you add their level or something like that. Oh, you know, and again, there's also environmental conditions, you know, whether it's slippery, whether it's, you know, raining, snowing, whatever. But, you know, anything that might affect that check, of course, is up to the game master to decide, is it an easy check, is it a medium check, or is it a hard check? And then they add numbers to the base 12 or the base 18. But the nice thing is that you can count on that base. It's a single mechanic that is used across the game for all kinds of attribute checks. So it sort of takes all of those sort of subsystems that existed in older versions of D&D and, you know, sets them aside and says we're going to use one core mechanic to do attribute checks. And then we have, of course, the combat mechanic, which is to hit versus AC. like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, it has most of the traditional classes that you are used to seeing in the older versions of the Player's Handbook. Fighter, ranger, paladin, barbarian, clerics with druids, monks, rogues with bards, and the assassin class, like in first edition. Wizards and illusionists, but that's it. Wizard, illusionist. There's no like wizard specialists per se that doesn't do the schools of magic. It may in one of the expansions, but I'm not here to talk about that. Base game, and again, the races, the cultures are just like in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You know, human, elf, dwarf, halfling, gnome, half elf, half orc. And basically that's it. So the sort of old school base classes, the old school base races. It does add, a couple of the ones like there's a knight class, which is like the old school cavalier, but without all the OP-ness that the cavaliers had from Unearthed Arcana, the original Unearthed Arcana, first edition Unearthed Arcana, that is. So you have a knight class, which is like a paladin class, but you're not dedicated to religion. You're dedicated to the chivalrous code and whatnot. Different than, say, your standard fighter and whatnot. And of course, Barbarian is one of the newer classes, in terms of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Again, but it uses all those sort of first edition classes. There's no after character creation. There's no sort of decision. All of your special abilities are built into the class. You have a backstab ability as a rogue, as an example, and that ability improves as you hit certain levels. Fourth level, maybe you get more damage. At another level, you're able to use that not just from a back attack, but from other sneak attack, angles. So it's a lot like the old school D&D where it was a backstab. Early in the early edition, you had to be behind the guy, you had to be sneaking up on him and stab him in the back. And again, though, as you go up in level, you can use that, more like the newer version of sneak attack. As you're a higher level, distractions in combat allow you to get in there and do your little, I gotcha. So similar to the ranger, you get certain abilities at third level or fifth level or whatnot. You get your extra attack, those types of things. But all that is built into the classes as written. So you just pick your class. It's all there. You're not making choices. You're not worried about character creation during your leveling up. All that stuff is sort of predefined for you. So it takes that sort of rules light philosophy that says, we don't want you thinking about your character mechanically as you level up. All that stuff's already there for you. You want to focus on your persona, and what type of person this is. It's very much pick your class and boom, you're ready to go. You don't have to worry about any of the other decisions. It has the old school attribute 3d6, not just straight down the line. You do get to pick where your 3d6 scores go, but you roll 3d6 6 times, and those are your scores. So it's a little bit it takes the power a notch or two down from the other editions, because the bell curve of that 3d6 is not, doesn't have that big hump in the middle. But the nice thing about that is that you're not totally out of luck if you get a bad roll, because the bonuses are also a little bit broader. So at a level 18, instead of getting like a +5 or something really high like in 5th edition D&D, your level 18, your bonus is +3 instead. So it's like +1 at 13, +2 at 16, and +3 at 18. So it's a broader spread, and that means your 8 is, if you roll an 8 and you get a bad score, it's actually only 2 different from 15, because an 8 is only a -1 and a 15 is only a +1. So you actually, those two characters mechanically, you're not totally screwed by a bad, sorry, I shouldn't say, you're not out of luck if you have a bad roll. And that's okay. And that's another nice thing about some of these old school games, is that people don't realize the ability scores, even though the way you rolled them up was more challenging. You weren't always out of luck, even if you had a few bad rolls. It was your negatives were not terrible. Like in the old school games, also your attributes usually don't go up unless there's some significant magical event. Like you find some one of those tomes that raises your, those special magical tomes that are almost artifact level that raise your ability scores. But from just leveling up, you don't get better ability scores. You get better hit points, but your ability scores essentially stay the same. So there isn't the same curve, the same trajectory you get that you got in third edition, fourth edition, and fifth edition. It's definitely more like first and second edition advanced Dungeons and Dragons or basic Dungeons and Dragons from the 80s. So that's really nice. What I like it because it does mean that there isn't that. There's a certain point in newer versions of D&D where you're no longer just heroes. You kind of step into that realm of superheroes. You get so powerful. You have a lot of hit points, but you have all the special abilities, and your ability scores have ramped up. Your proficiency bonuses have ramped up. So you really do, despite fifth edition using what's called bounded accuracy to try to keep things a little bit less super heroic, it's still a pretty big power spike as you go up in levels. And while that is not necessarily true for old school games like Castles and Crusades, there is still, your hit points do climb. You definitely do get better. You have better equipment, and you have some better capabilities. Your class does have more traits and abilities as they get better, but it's definitely that it's not one of those big curves that okay, man, I've made it to 8th, 9th, 10th level. Now I'm like, uber hard to kill. And so that's really a nice thing about the Castles and Crusades. The other thing I want to say about Troller games, they're very prolific. They do a lot of support, campaign support, adventure support for the game. They have all these great modules. The C series, my favorite is actually the A series, the Assault on Blacktooth Ridge. This is absolutely one of the best written modules in the modern era, and the great news is that they also have a D&D 5th edition version of this particular module, Assault on Blacktooth Ridge. I love this. It's, two of the best classic modules are the Village of Hamlet, T1, and Keep On in the Borderlands, B2. Those are both probably the most well-known of those early Gygax modules. There's a home base, either village or the keep. You go out into the wilderness, and there's some the caves. B2 has the caves with all the different factions in it. Village of Hamlet has the moat house, which can lead to a larger adventure. Although I'm not a big fan of Temple of Elemental Evil, it's a bit of a slog. But the original T1, the Village of Hamlet, that portion of the adventure, the original module without all the super dungeon, Temple of Elemental Evil, is so great. I mean, just that really nice home base area, a wonderful village with different NPCs, and then the moat house and the moat house dungeon. I love it. It's just a classic, great starter, campaign starter, similar to Keeping on Borderlands. This absolutely has all of this. Assault on Blacktooth Ridge has this wonderful starter village that's part of a larger kingdom. It has these caves up on the mountainside in the foothills and the mountains. There's different caves, little mini dungeons, and some large dungeons. There's lots of NPC hooks in there that aren't necessarily full adventure ideas that are built out in the module, but give the DM some things to sort of improv with. It talks about some of the different villagers and what their issues are, what their problems are, and there's like little teeny adventure hooks buried in their descriptions of the NPCs. And the DM can or the castle keeper in the case of Castles and Crusades, but the game master can totally run with those ideas or kind of just gloss over them, move past them, and focus on sort of the main storyline. So even though the Assault on Blacktooth Ridge is a sort of a pre-baked adventure, there's a lot of stuff in here that can allow you to make it a lot more like a sandbox. Um, and Davis and Steven Chano, who are the Trollord fellas, first off, really, really fantastic guys. I've met them several times. I catch up with them at conventions. I've played with Davis in a Castles and Crusades game. Um, really stand-up guy, nicest people you could possibly meet. Small independent press guys. So absolutely, go out and check out Castles and Crusades. Their player's handbook right now is free to download. So there's really no reason not to. And absolutely, even if you are playing 5th edition and you're not necessarily ready to jump into Castles and Crusades as a side thing, check out their 5th edition modules. They have a whole bunch. A0 and A1 are two of my favorites. A1 is absolutely up there with Keep on the Borderlands and Village of Hamlet. It absolutely is at that same level. I mean, it's truly a classic, and it does not get a lot of attention out in the D&D world, and I absolutely think it should. It's a brilliant piece of work. Great work by Davis. And I mean, that's pretty much it. Trollord is not paying me or giving me stuff. I'm just a huge fan of their writing. Castles and Crusades. They have they have the Amazing Adventures, which is sort of the pulp style game, and they have a 5e version of Amazing Adventures. So if you're familiar with D&D mechanics, you can play a modern pulp action game using those sort of same D&D mechanics. But again, check out Castles and Crusades. There's absolutely no reason for you not to download a free player's handbook. Even if you don't play it, look at it, read it, get that old school flavor, and say, hey guys, why don't we run this for fun? Do a one shot or do something like that. And they have a lot of small. Assault on Blacktooth Ridge is a bit of a larger module, but they have a lot of little ones, especially stuff they did for Free RPG Day, which you can get for like $2 off their website. Druid's Lament, which is one they put out for Free RPG Day. They almost always support Free RPG Day. They're just a great community oriented small press group of folks. So absolutely support Trollord Games. Check out the Trollord Games store and purchase and download the Player's Handbook for free for a limited time. So if you're watching this video, go ahead and do it right now. That's pretty much all I have to say. I really enjoy Castles and Crusades. I think it's a great old school throwback to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And if you've never played AD&D and you don't want to go through all of the sort of nuances, tricky nuances of the old school rules, and believe me, there's a lot of them. I grew up on AD&D. There's a lot of stuff that we even just plain ignored because there's so much in those old books, both wonderful and terrible at the same time, to be honest. So that's one of the reasons I absolutely love Castles and Crusades, because it is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but cleaned up, modern rule set, very easy to run, easy to play, easy to learn. It's just a fantastic game. So I've been Marty Walser, also known as Raging Owlbear. Please like and subscribe my videos. I'm trying to get a little bit of attention if I can on YouTube and the Twitters. The joke. The Googles, the Twitters, and the Facebooks. So, like and subscribe. I put out these videos pretty intermittently. I've been doing more recently because obviously we have the crisis on our hands, the pandemic. But click the little ding button for your subscribe, because I don't put these out that often, and sometimes there's big gaps, so I'll put out a few in a row and then stop for a while because wife, kids, mortgage, pandemic, lots of things going on in our lives. And then I might throw one up, a couple weeks down the road. So it's not really a regular interval. So go ahead and please put the notification on for me. It's not going to ding at you every other day. It's just going to throw up, maybe once a week or so, if that. But anyways, thanks for listening to my video. I've rambled on a little bit too much. I really love Castles and Crusades. There's no reason not to check it out. I'll put links on the video for their modules, 5th edition modules, their CNC modules, and to the store, to the Troller Game Store. I'll see you around. Peace out. Have fun gaming.